Hello everybody. So this is Integumentary System Notes Part 2, and we start off talking about skin color. And you can see here that we first consider melanin, and depending on where you are in the class, what period you're in, we might have already talked about this. But melanin comes in 4 different forms. It's yellow, red, brown, and black, and this is genetically determined from or by where your ancestors originally were from. Back in the day, people did not move around as much as they do now. So people evolved and changed, and generally those genes stayed in one area because people did not move around that much. So we generally think of this melanin being brown and black, but we have some variations that have come from people of Northern European descent. Yellow is what we consider blonde. So blonde hair is not white. There is a pigmentation to it. And you can have variations. Somebody can have some yellow pigment. Somebody can also have some red pigment. So you can get strawberry blonde. Brown and black, as you know, comes in many, many varieties and shades. Brown and black skin pigmentation, in addition to yellow, can also be found in a person's skin. That's right, yellow pigmentation can be found in a person's skin. Some people with Asian descent have more yellow pigmentation in their skin. So pretty much, these all come from genes that have a few mutations, and they're almost exactly the same. Just a couple mutations that have happened in particular places have caused those pigments to reflect light just a little bit differently. That's pretty much the only difference. So melanin is made by melanocytes, which are found at the barrier between where the epidermis and dermis come together. And the big purpose of melanin has to do with vitamins and protection from skin cancers. So we'll talk more about vitamins later in the class. We'll kind of focus a bit more on the cancer part of it and the other coloration of the skin you see. Melanin protects from sun damage and from potential cancers. It doesn't protect perfectly because obviously skin cancers still happen. And with depletion of the ozone layer in the past 50 years, we've seen skin cancers rise. People with lighter skin obviously can have more problems with skin cancer than darker skin people, but darker skin people can also get cancers, and oftentimes the darker pigmentation that their skin has often hides moles that have become or turned into melanoma, which is a very dangerous form of skin cancer. So it makes sense that this melanin would be right where the dermal area begins, because the cells of the dermis do not shed away. The epidermis sheds away. You don't need to protect a cell from cancer if it's going to shed away in a week. So it makes sense that it would be there. I'm not going to talk about the vitamins right now, but there's a big part of what vitamin D and folate and melanin have to do with our evolution and why people are different skin colors. So more on that a little bit later on. So other skin colors we can find that aren't pigmented by melanin itself, and these generally occur in a person or persons who have lighter skin, what's a little bit easier to see. But blood vessels close to the skin will obviously make it pure red if those blood vessels are dilated, or if that person has little to no melanin in their skin. So it's very easy to see that in light-skinned people. And if the blood vessels near the surface of the skin do not need to be dilated, most likely because they're trying to conserve heat that is traveling around in that blood, their skin will not be red anymore. But light-colored people can also have their skin pigmented by bile salts. So this is a form of jaundice. So you can see that definitely in the eyes. But someone has light skin, they might have a yellowish pigment because their liver is not properly breaking down bile salts. And also, everybody's skin, even though it's not hard to see in some people, has keratin in it, which comes from beta-carotene, which is basically a form of vitamin A that is stored in the skin. So this gives skin a little bit of a yellowish color, in addition to the yellow melanin that some people have. If somebody consumes too much squash or carrots, their skin can actually take on an orangey color if the skin is very light. And you have to eat a lot of this. Sometimes this happens to babies too, when mothers give too much of that carrot baby food to kids. You gotta eat a lot though. And the fourth is you have a blue coloration, and you can see this in dark-skinned people, but it's a lot harder to see, obviously. But this is where somebody has a heart condition or a lung condition like COPD, where they are not able to get enough oxygen into their body. So that means they're pretty sick, one way or another. So that's called cyanosis. All right, so going back to the skin thing, the equator is right here, and the seasons of the equator do not change very much. So the amount of sun that is hitting this area primarily stays the same. Whereas in the seasons, the northern and southern latitudes change a lot if it's summer or winter. You can see there's much less landmass down here. You can probably even see my mouse here. It's much less landmass in the southern hemisphere. So there's less of an effect from the seasons because there's just not enough land there, and there's not a lot of people living in that area compared to the northern hemisphere. So the skin coloration, so this is going back, genetically, before people started moving around a lot and people were walking or on horseback. People didn't get around that much. So particular genes stayed in one area. And genes for lighter skin generally stayed in the northern latitudes. And you can see there's some in the southern latitudes also, but generally there wasn't a lot of people living in those areas. And the southern tips of South America and Australia are pretty difficult places to live due to their distance from the equator. Anyways, this gives you a general idea. If you're from a particular country or area of the world, generally where your skin tones are going to be. It's not a perfect map, but you get the idea. So as people moved away, started walking, riding on horseback away from the equator, they found that there was less sunlight, so their bodies had to make a compromise between the amount of vitamin D that needed to be produced. So lighter skin is going to allow more sunlight to get in through the skin layers to make vitamin D into the dermis, which is a good thing. It's bad for skin cancer, and it's also bad for keeping the amount of folate that males need for sperm production and females need for healthy babies. So there's a trade-off there. We'll talk about some stuff in class that explains that much greater detail. So there's the melanocytes. You see their pigmented colors, and then you can see here this part is darker than the part below it. So these pigmented molecules are evenly spread out throughout the epidermis. But you can see obviously where they're darker. That's where the melanocytes are. So there's a little boy. He's got albinism. So got blue eyes, white skin, very, very white hair, and white eyebrows. So this is where the body has the genes to make melanocytes, but those melanocytes are not activated. And you can see the eyes usually are a bluish color. Of course, you can get variation with this. But primarily, you're going to find light-colored eyes, obviously. Eyes are not going to be white or red. Usually blue in color. So, there's a little girl who is of African descent. And you can see she has a form of albinism that occurs in certain populations of people from Africa. And you can see she's got some pigmentation on her forehead and cheeks, potentially from damage from the sun. So if you're an albino and you're living in equatorial Africa, you're most likely going to have some problems with skin cancer and other mutations that can happen in the skin because you just don't have the protection you need. And here we have some African people who are devoid of the pigmentation, or they lost the pigmentation. You can see that they retain characteristics of their African descent. But I put this slide on here just to highlight that really all the differences in colors that you see in people around the world, whether they're dark or light, is just from the amount of coloration that is made in their skin. Facial features are going to be retained from genetics, from wherever your family is from. But the skin color is just from this pigmentation that we all have the ability to make. It's just our cells, our DNA and these melanocyte cells, either they get the genetic signal to make lots of melanin, or they don't. Or they get a genetic signal to make small amount of melanin. That's all it is. It's whether these genes are switched on or not. Okay, Michael Jackson, you can see he's got a picture on the bottom from when he was young, And you got a picture from when he was much older. He had a condition, vitiligo, and you can see how detrimental this would be, to someone who was conscientious of how they look, because that sticks out a lot. Having one type of color doesn't stick out very much, but when it looks like you're losing your colors in the hands, and this happens or starts on the hands a lot, so some people have said that's why Michael Jackson used to wear his one glove. Anybody knows about that? Because he had much lighter skin when he was older, and towards when he died. He had some other, medical issues going on too, but this is very gradual and been documented over the years. And he hit it pretty well. You never saw him with too much splotchiness like you see in that person's hands. There's particular treatments that you can do to minimize that. I don't really know too much about that, but I'm sure he used his money and his wealth to get the best treatments available. There is also no one alive today that has this condition, but in the past has been documented people that their skin has literally been blue. The Fugate family, back in the 1800s, in isolated Troublesome Creek, Kentucky, had a little trouble finding mates that were outside the family. So there's some inbreeding going on. And I don't really know how much inbreeding, how close it was, but when you start getting inbreeding going on, even from cousin to first cousin to first cousin, the genes are very, very similar. And if that happens a few times, you start to get these recessive genetic mutations that are normally hidden, and we all have these recessive genetic mutations that are inside of us, but most likely you're not going to run into somebody else who has the same recessive genetic mutation that you do. However, if you are inbreeding, very likely, and it's very likely that you're going to have strange medical conditions that are going to show up. So this particular disease, obviously it's pretty rare, methemoglobinemia, is due to the absence of an enzyme diphorase. It's a necessary enzyme that converts methemoglobin to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what carries your oxygen around in your body, and it turns your blood bright red. So when you lack oxygen, your blood has a dark, reddish, it almost looks bluish in tint. When you have this condition, though, your blood is literally bluish in tint. And these were Caucasian people, so it gave their skin a literal bluish tint. It was almost like they had, if you go back up here, cyanosis. But they were perfectly healthy otherwise. And it was a deep, deep cyanosis, as it was described. So we'll talk more about that in class. And there's some people, let me go back for a second, 1950, that's what it is. In the 50s and 60s, they actually treated this with something called methylene blue. It's a strong oxidizer, which actually took care of the diphorase problem. Interesting. Anyways, there's no pictures of this family. There's an artist's conception of it, because this was back before they actually used cameras. But this is what they look like. Bluish skin. And go back to the pedigree here. You can basically see every time there was a blue square on there, that was somebody who was blue. The carriers had the dots blue. Two carriers come together. You can make someone who is blue. But you can see all the inbreeding going on. All the double lines on here. Those are going to be where two people have inbred the families. And if you look at this closely, you start following the squares of boys, circles of girls. I remember this in biology class. And there was a heck of a lot of inbreeding going on in the early 1800s. Crazy stuff. Okay, so other conditions can turn your skin a bluish silver. Argyria, this is from consumption of too much silver. I think this guy was taking some sort of medicine, and the silver got deposited in his skin. And this used to happen to silver miners. And I don't exactly know how long it stays there. If I remember reading this a long time ago, it stays for a long time. It'll dissipate eventually. Pretty crazy, huh? I imagine this what the Fugate family looks similar to. Nuts. Anyways, so some other skin features. We have freckles. These are areas of concentrated melanin. These are usually on places of only fair-skinned people that are exposed to the sun. So obviously the face and arms. Moles are a little bit different. This one looks pretty nasty. But moles are generally harmless, unless they turn into melanoma. But these are when melanocytes cluster and bulge out of the skin instead of remaining spread out. Because they are spread out throughout the skin and they're buried down further in the epidermis. But moles are when they reproduce very, very quickly and come to the surface. Because remember, it's only about, a sheet of paper, the epidermis. That's about how thick it is. So it doesn't take much for these guys to pop out. Okay, some other accessory structures. We get the hair and nails. So both hair and nails are made out of keratin. They're both dead. Similar to the stratum corneum of your skin. You get about 2.5 million hairs on your body. And their purpose was to keep early humans warm. And I guess they do the same purpose for our heads. They also made and make, they continue to do this today, organisms, or I should say mammals with hair, and made them appear bigger when in danger. Cats do this. You ever seen a cat turn sideways and when they're freaked out the hair stands up? So it's supposed to make them look more imposing, telling the other organism that's giving them the threat to say, don't mess with me, I'm big and strong. So these little muscles called erectopili make the hair stand up. So we still have these erectopili, and even if we don't have hair sticking out of our body, they're still there. There's still hair follicles there. So when we are cold or when we are nervous or scared, these erectopili are stimulated, and what they do is give us goosebumps. So it's the same mechanism that makes animals' hair stand up. Making animals' hair stand up also when they're cold, what it does is it fluffs up the hair a little bit, so the air that gets trapped in between the outside of the body and the air that is next to the skin where the hair is, that air near the skin that's puffed up actually warms up faster than the outside, so it keeps heat from radiating outside the body as much. So when you're cold, that's why you get goosebumps. So I get goosebumps when you're scared. That's a whole other hormone thing. Okay. So we talked about in class, or we'll talk about in class, why we have lost our hair, and it has to do with temperature and moving to places in Africa where it was very hot and we need to forage for food longer. So people with less hair were able to get more food, potentially pass their genes on, and eventually the human species lost a lot of our hair to where we are today. Nails are similar in structure to claws of other animals. They think the purpose now and why they're flat like this because they give our fingertips a lot of structure. If you push on your fingertip, that nail keeps that tip of that finger from bending backwards. So it does help us with grasping and tool use. But they are otherwise useless for claws. So they might just be there as a vestigial organ, meaning an organ that we just carry the genes for, but we don't really use it for anything else. They could also be there for what we call sexual selection. So somebody without nails looks weird, so potential mates might avoid that person. And, maybe that's not such a big deal nowadays, but, back in the day, if you had any little problem, you might not mate, you might not pass your genes on. And here's a picture of the erectopili. And this is hair coming out. This is the hair follicle, which is basically where the hair is made. So these will contract, and they will stand the hair up. And this is George Clooney, I believe, but focus on his hair. So he's got gray hair, but it's not really gray. It's actually a mixture of white and dark colored hairs. So as men and women get older, some of their hair follicles will lose their melanin, and some will retain it. So the mixture of dark and light appears gray, but really it's white and dark hairs put together. People who have blonde hair, their hair will just simply turn white. It'll turn lighter and lighter and lighter. It looks like it's lighter blonde, but it's actually turning white. So they won't have gray hair because they don't have dark melanin. And it's kind of a structure of the fingernail. So the nail is dead. However, when it is made in the matrix, the cells are alive, and as they get pushed out, just like the skin, they get away from the blood vessels and they die. Other accessory organs, we have the skin glands. So we have sebaceous glands and sweat glands. Sebaceous glands produce the oil that lubricates not only the hairs on our body, but they also lubricate the skin. And they keep that skin supple and waterproof. So they work with keratin to keep the water out. They're found in the hair follicle, so as hair leaves the hair follicle, you can see it right here. This is a sebaceous gland right here. They are coated in oil. That oil obviously keeps the hair from falling apart much quicker than it would otherwise. But also in many animals that are out in the environment, oil on their hair helps keep water from touching their skin, which thus stealing some of their heat, because oil and water don't mix. Think of a golden retriever. Golden retrievers love water, just like all dogs. But when they get wet, they smell really awful. They have really oily fur. They smell really awful because there's bacteria that are living on their fur, and the combination of the oils from their fur and the water, they actually are able to digest that oil, and they give off a musky smell, which is very similar to what's happening with our sweat glands. We've got two different kinds. The ones in our armpits and groin, a little bit different from everywhere else. Apical sweat glands have a high fat content. And, these secretions were used as communication in other animals. They are used to mark territory. They're used to, if they're sprayed somewhere on the ground, the female might tell males are in heat. So with us, they don't really know, or haven't figured out a reason why we have these. It could just be a vestigial organ, just like our fingernails or our eyebrows, that aren't really there for a reason, other than the genes are hanging around, but haven't been taken out of our genome because they haven't done anything bad. Their high fat content means that they are extremely attracted by bacteria. Bacteria eat the fat that comes out of the sweat. And this is primarily the reason why those areas of our body smell, because the bacteria are feeding off of the sweat, and basically they're farting out a waste gas that gives us our musky odor, similar to what's happening with the golden retrievers. The other sweat glands, merocrine glands, they secrete water, salt, and urea and some other material. The urea that comes out is basically the same thing that's in your urine. So basically when you sweat, you're peeing. So it's a way of the body getting rid of some waste, a convenient way. But it's used mainly for evaporative cooling. There's other types of bacteria that feed on that urea. And these bacteria everywhere in the environment, they're living on your body, they're in all your stuff. You shower, you are washing off a lot of the salts and urea and fats. So you are cleaning yourself, but you're not really getting the bacteria off. You're getting some of them off, obviously. But some will remain, and their numbers will increase as you go throughout the day, and you naturally are secreting, a little bit of sweat, either from the apical glands or the merocrine glands. And the bacteria are very quickly going to divide, and they're going to start feeding, and then the musky smell is going to come back, and then we'll repeat the process 24 hours later when you shower again. And if you don't shower for 2 or 3 or 4 days, you know what happens. You get stinky. And probably if everybody did this, it wouldn't be a big deal. You just get used to the way everybody smelled. But in our society nowadays, you're not supposed to smell like that. So that's why we clean ourselves often. It's kind of a futile process in a way, though. So there's a lot of things going on with the skin. We've talked a lot about these things. We still have to talk about some of the pressure receptors. So we'll do a little practice in class when we finish talking about those right before your next test. But there's a lot of things going on in the skin, for sure. Alright, so here is a picture of a hair follicle, and you see some oil glands making some oil. This is normal. However, during puberty, you have an excessive amount of oil being produced out of these hair follicles because of what's going on in puberty. Hormones are activating these. And if your face is not terribly clean, Or if it's even partially clean, some of these hair follicles can get blocked with dirt, but the oils are still being made. So what do you get? A pimple. They're also called whiteheads. So if that pimple remains long enough, that material can, what they call oxidize, which basically becomes hard and crusty, and then the oil can stay stuck inside of that follicle. And since bacteria like to eat oil, this is basically a bacteria buffet. So you can get infections very easily. And people with particular genetics will have more of a problem with this than others. But hopefully, being in this class, 11th, 12th grade, you're pretty much past this point. Alright, the last couple things we talk about is burns. So you got first, second degree burns. First, second, and third degree burns. So the first is epidermis only. This is painful. Everybody's had these. Usually heals in a couple days. Just really damages the first few layers inside the epidermis. First few stratums. Depending, you can go all the way down if it wants. Second degree burns will burn through the entire epidermis. Some of the upper dermis will be burned also. So this is very painful. This takes a couple weeks. This would be a serious burn, and we've all had these. Hopefully in small amounts, I'm touching the stove by accident or something like that. Generally, it doesn't scar, and it's still very painful, just like a first degree burn, because you're touching all the nerve endings. And these will grow back, but if it's too big of an area, you'll have to get skin grafts. And they can take your skin, they can grow it in the laboratory and put it back on you, or they can take small strips of skin and put them on these areas if needed. Third degree burns are very serious because it destroys both the dermis and the epidermis. There's no pain in the sense that most of the nerve endings have been burned away, but there's going to be pain in other areas because the tissue is damaged. So skin grafts are definitely going to be needed here because the cells they're gone, especially if it's a larger area. And usually when you have a third degree burn, you come in contact with fire, so or something very, very hot in a large area where you need some help from doctors. So I'm going to show you some pictures. Some of them are kind of nasty. So obviously that's where the dermis and epidermis. First degree burn. So this would be a first degree or second degree burn. Depends on where it is, but this is blistering that happens. So this is basically... So this is when white blood cells are basically cleaning up the dead tissue, killing bacteria and viruses. So they make pus. Pus is basically a combination of dead white blood cells and dead bacteria and virus and the leftovers of your skin that have been partially decomposed and digested by the white blood cells. Nasty, huh? So here you can see a combination second, third degree burn. Where the white part is where the dermis is gone. This is a really serious third degree burn. You can see the white part that's got down to the subcutaneous tissue. This is not a burn, but it kind of looks like it, and is painful, like it's called a bed sore. So it's a type of ulcer when people who cannot move themselves, like in nursing homes or paralyzed people, they constantly need to be moved every 2 to 3 hours by nurses. Because what happens, the pressure points in your body where your bones stick out, if you stay too long on one of those pressure points, the blood flow in that localized area will cease because the bone is pushing on it, and the cells will literally die. So you get whole portions of your skin that dies. So in a good nursing home, you're not supposed to have people that have very many, if any, of these, because people have to be turned constantly. These pictures of different skin cancers. So you got carcinoma on the side, which is a benign form of skin cancer, but it can turn malignant if left long enough. It's pretty easy for people to see this and get it checked out. You know, you feel it and see it on your body. You see anything weird going on like this, for all you fair-skinned people, you know, they can usually just cut it off before it gets bad. On the right side is melanoma. Very serious, very low survival rate in the later stages. It's really like the very first stage when you can actually really treat it, and even then, survival rate is pretty low. Super serious stuff. Luckily, it's not as common as carcinoma. So scars are another thing that we see on skin, and the figure here is trying to show us a little bit about what's going on. You can see these little stringy things. So these are basically the collagen and elastin fibers. That's not what I wanted to do. Get out of there. So these are, I think I clicked on the picture by accident. Stop that. So you can see the elastin and collagen fibers filling in the gap where there was some damage here. And you can see the damage right here. So this is when the body needs to close up this opening very, very quickly. And a scar forms when the epidermal cells, basically cells of the stratum basale, which would be right in here, no longer exist, and there's not time for them to migrate back in this area. So it basically fills up with collagen and elastin fibers, and that's where you get a scar. And that's going to be a permanent thing. Other scars are called keloids. I have one of these on my arm. These can come from bug bites, bad cuts you've had, types of irritation. You can see they kind of look like carcinoma a little bit, but they are shiny on the edges and they're a raised bump. And see, that's what carcinoma looks like there. So they're kind of similar in a weird way. But it's basically a form of scar tissue, and sometimes people have these all over their bodies. Sometimes they're huge. Alright, I think we've hit upon all the major stuff. Thanks for listening.